Okay, welcome to chapter 22 on the lymphatic system and immunity. This is going to be a pretty beefy chapter, so I apologize in advance about the long presentation, but there's a lot of info to cover. So let's get started. So this portion of the presentation is going to focus on the lymphatic system, and then we'll move into all the stuff with the immune system. But starting out with the lymphatic system, has a couple different functions. Some of them are related to immune, some of them are just related to fluid balance and maintaining homeostasis through fluid balance. So for fluid balance, it's all about having any excess interstitial fluid and filtering that out into lymph in the capillaries. So you know from the last unit that in addition to moving blood from the arterioles to the capillaries, there is some other fluids that are there as well. And with the lymphatic system, we can remove that and move it into lymphs to be filtered and possibly excreted. Additionally, your lymphatic system also is responsible for absorbing lipids. So you have special lymphatic vessels along the small intestine called lacteals that ultimately absorb those fatty materials and convert them to a fluid called chyle, which then can possibly be removed through the lymphatic ducts, or they can be pushed back into circulation. And then lastly, the quality that ties the lymphatic system into the immune system is all about defense. So several of the lymphatic organs are responsible for filtering blood or fighting against microorganisms or other substances that are not supposed to be in your body, such as your lymph and your lymph nodes. They're responsible again for filtering, and the blood in your spleen also is a filtration system. It also helps fight infections as well. So to break down all the different parts of the lymphatic system, we have many different structures all throughout the body. They're not all in a nice, neat row. But to break them down, first big piece is lymph. Lymph is just the actual interstitial fluid in the vessels themselves. Those vessels are called lymphatic vessels. Think of your lymphatic vessels kind of like veins, because unlike your arteries, they're not attached to a pump, in this case, the heart. So the valves in the lymphatic vessels, similar to veins, allow that lymphatic fluid or lymph to move in one direction, keep it unidirectional. Then along those lymphatic vessels, you have lymph nodes. Those lymph nodes are these little round structures that ultimately filter that lymph. Then you have your tonsils, and your tonsils are these masses of lymphoid tissue that are in the throat, and they produce B cells and T cells that can help fight infection. You then have your spleen, which is an organ for filtering blood. And then you have your thymus gland, which is responsible for producing the hormone thymosin, which helps with maturation of B cells and T cells. So getting a little more into lymphatic vessels, we have your lymphatic capillaries, which are these this mesh of vessels that form around your capillaries, around organs and tissues. That's how the lymph or the extra interstitial fluid gets from the capillaries into the lymphatic system, is from your capillaries between the arterioles and the venules to the lymphatic capillaries. Those lymphatic capillaries then move into lymphatic vessels, which are again like veins. They have valves that move the fluid in one direction. Again, you have your lymph nodes. These nodes are distributed along the vessel. So every so often, a vessel will run into a node and be filtered. Then those vessels will eventually reach larger converging areas called lymphatic trunks. And those trunks will then converge into one of two lymphatic ducts. And these are just major drainage sites in the body. You have two lymphatic ducts. You have the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct. So the right lymphatic duct basically drains everything from the right side of your head to the right thorax. Anything below and the entire left side of the body is your thoracic duct. So again, right head to right thorax, right lymphatic duct, everything below that and the entire left side of the body is the thoracic duct. So to show you some diagrams, here we have your arterioles, which we know pump blood from the heart, and your venules, which pick up blood after they've gone through the blood capillaries. But running alongside those blood capillaries are your lymphatic capillaries, which again filter any extra fluid from the blood capillaries to the lymphatic system. That fluid then gets moved to the lymphatic vessels, which again are like veins. They have those valves which shut and prevent that backflow, keeping that fluid moving in one direction. Then you have your vessels eventually get to your trunks, and there's a bunch of different trunks. You have several ones on the right, the jugular, subclavian, and bronchomediastinal, and then you have those three on the left as well. And those converge into the thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct. The right lymphatic duct is right about here, but for some reason is not shown on the diagram. But this diagram right here, down where we see C, highlights those areas about what controls what. So the right lymphatic duct highlights all of the lymph fluid that's drained from, again, the right head, the right thorax, and the right arm. And then the thoracic ducts, to which all of the left lymphatic ducts drain into, gets all the left side of the body, and then the right portion of the body below the thorax. Okay. So your lymphatic organs ultimately are made up of lymphatic tissue. And these tissues are made up of reticular fibers. You'll probably remember reticular fibers when you learned about tissues in 157, because your reticular connective tissue is one of the different forms of connective tissue you learned about. So reticular fibers are made up of reticular cells. These again allow for the lymphatic tissues like your spleen and your tonsils, etc., to maintain their structure. And then they have that special type of cell, that white blood cell called lymphocytes. Your lymphocytes, there's a bunch of different types, but for right now we're just going to generally call them B cells and T cells. And then these cells are responsible for fighting off infection. Depending on the actual organ itself or the structure, it may or may not have a capsule, which is just sort of an outer covering. Things like your lymph nodes and your spleen, your thymus, all have this capsule sort of enclosing the structure. However, there are some instances where you have lymphatic tissue surrounding other organs that are not considered encapsulated. And when this occurs, it's called mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, or MALT for short. And this occurs in different situations, like around the urinary tract, around the digestive system. These are instances where we have, again, that lymphoid tissue, but these organs are not encapsulated. So, outside of the actual lymphatic vessels, the first thing we're going to talk about is the tonsils. The tonsils, you have three sets of them. You have the palatine, pharyngeal, and lingual. And your palatine tonsils are towards the back of the oral cavity. You have one on each side. The pharyngeal are along the roof of your mouth between the oral cavity and the pharynx. And then you have the lingual, which is towards the back of the oral cavity, behind the tongue. And ultimately, your tonsils are all about providing protection against anything that gets in the oral cavity, anything that gets in the mouth. So they have those B cells and T cells that they can release to destroy any possible invaders or microbes. Next, we have our lymph nodes. And again, these are small structures that filter your lymph. Lymph nodes can be broken down into a cortex portion and a medulla portion, and they are made up of dense connective tissue with that capsule. You have two types of vessels that go into and out of the lymphatic vessels. The lymphatic vessels that go into the lymph nodes are called afferent, and the lymphatic vessels that leave the lymph node are called efferent. So afferent comes in, efferent leaves. And in your lymphatic nodes, you have this special tissue with the, you have the special area called germinal centers, which basically produce the majority of lymphocytes for the lymph nodes. So to show you that in diagram form, we have the lymph node, again, this spherical organ or spherical structure. It has this green capsule on the outside. Then on the inner portion, we have a cortex, which is this outer portion right here. And then we have the medulla, which is this inner portion right here. Your cortex has what's called lymphatic nodules. These little circles you see at the edge of the cortex. And in those nodules, you have your germinal centers, which produce your lymphocytes, so those B cells and those T cells. Then in the middle of the lymph node, you have the medulla, which is this sort of inner space with the medullary cord and medullary sinus. And then you have your afferent vessels going into the lymph node and your efferent vessels leaving the lymph node. All right, next up is the spleen. The spleen is responsible for a couple different things. Generally, we say it just filters blood, but specifically within that task, it does a couple different things. By filtering the blood, it's ultimately able to get rid of any red blood cells that aren't doing their job. We know that red blood cells are only in circulation for 100 to 120 days. So eventually they'll have to be broken down and removed by hemolysis, and your spleen is responsible for doing that part. Additionally, your spleen also helps with the lymphatic system by having those lymphocyte cells fight against foreign substances. Additionally, similar to your veins, your spleen can actually store a little bit of blood. So the spleen itself is broken down into two areas of pulp. So you have white pulp and you have red pulp. The white pulp is the area immediately surrounding the splenic arteries coming in. And you have two pieces of the white pulp. You have what's called the periarterial lymphatic sheath. So peri means around and arterial means artery, so it's just around the artery. So this is just some lymphatic tissue that immediately surrounds the artery. Within that white pulp, you also have your lymphatic nodules. Again, these have your germinal centers, which produce your lymphocytes. Then one layer superficial to the white pulp is your red pulp. And this is more your fibrous tissue, which has a mix of red blood cells as well as macrophages. Macrophages are also a type of white blood cell. Within that red pulp, you have two structures. You have what are called the splenic cords. These are made of your reticular cells, which are made of reticular fibers. Again, this is a type of connective tissue that gives it structure and support for the spleen. And then within the red pulp, you also have your venous sinuses. And these are just capillaries that move blood between the spleen artery and the spleen veins. So to show you all that, we have an outer look at the spleen, splenic artery going in, splenic vein leaving. And if we look at a cross section where the arteries branch into smaller portions, we have this white tissue right here. That's your white pulp. And then just outside of that, this sort of meshy network area is your red pulp. If we zoom in to the red pulp and white pulp area along the splenic artery, we have your white pulp immediately surrounding it. There we have those periarterial lymphatic sheaths. Again, they're immediately surrounding the artery, wrapping around it. And then we have your lymphatic nodules, which are the little circles that I'm drawing my mouse around. Those, again, have those germinal centers, allowing for a lymphocyte production. So white space is periarterial lymphatic sheaths. The circles are the lymphatic nodules. Then for red pulp, we have your splenic cord, which are all these little red fibers right here running all along. Again, those have your reticular fibers from your reticular cells for structural support. And then your venous sinus, again, is a capillary running between the artery and the vein. Okay. Then we have the thymus. And this is a specific gland that runs on top of the heart in the superior mediastinum. Your thymus is broken down into a couple of different lobes, and then those lobes are divided into further subsections called lobules. So think lobule like a little lobe. The lobules themselves, much like your lymphatic nodes, have a cortex and medulla portion. And for your cortex, that's again the outer region. You have the area that produces and has the storage of a bunch of lymphocytes. So again, a lot of your B cells, T cells. And then you have that inner portion called the medulla, which doesn't have as many lymphocytes there, but it does have what are called thymic corpuscles. These are very important because they produce a very special type of T cell called your regulatory T cells. Your regulatory T cells are actually responsible for suppressing your immune system in certain scenarios, such as preventing your body from attacking its own cells. Additionally, within the thymus, it produces a very important hormone called thymosin, and this is where your T cells are able to, or this hormone allows your T cells to mature, to go from immature T cells, which are called pre-T cells, into mature T cells, which are just called T cells. So, show you a picture of that. We have the thymus, which has multiple lobes, and again, those lobes are broken down into lobules, which we see a cross section here. Outer portion is the cortex, which is where the bulk of the lymphocytes are stored in the thymus. And then the medulla is that inner portion, which has your regulatory T cell production from those thymic corpuscles. Okay, so that was a lot of different odds and ends and structures. So I'm going to do a little recap to go over everything once again. All right, so we know from the last unit we have your heart pumps blood to the arteries and the capillaries and then back to the veins, which will cycle back to the heart. When the blood gets to the capillaries, some of that fluid will be filtered into the lymphatic capillaries. Those lymphatic capillaries will run into your lymphatic vessels, which have valves. Those are these little bulbs along the vessels. Those valves prevent the fluid from flowing backwards. Again, make sure it is unidirectional. Eventually, those lymphatic vessels will run into a lymph node. That lymph node will filter the fluid. And remember, vessels that come in are called afferent. Vessels that leave are called efferent. Eventually, after we pass through the lymph nodes, we will reach the lymphatic trunks, which will then move into one of the two lymphatic ducts, either the thoracic duct or the right lymphatic duct. If that fluid needs to be removed, it will be excreted from the body. If it's not going to be removed, some of that lymph will then go back into circulation. Then you have what are called lacteals, those special lymphatic vessels along the small intestine of the digestive system. Those absorb your lipids and filter some into the thoracic duct to be removed from the body in what is called chyle. Some of that fluid may not be removed from the body, may just go back into circulation in the veins. Then you have your spleen, which is filtering blood and also helps with some of the immune responses. That blood can either be filtered or stored, or some of it can go back into circulation. Then with the bone marrow, we didn't talk about this too much, but we will in the next portion of the presentation. Your red bone marrow is where your pre-T cells and your pre-B cells originate, and those will move from the bone marrow into circulation. Then you have your thymus gland, which has the hormone thymosin, which allows your pre-T cells or your immature cells to mature into your T cells. And again, those will enter circulation. And lastly, your B and T cells are going to be moving all throughout the lymphatic tissues, all throughout the body. So in order to get to an area where there's an infection or a microbe that doesn't need to be there, your B cells and T cells can move everywhere. They can move through the lymphatic vessels, through the lymph nodes, through the spleen, through the ducts, you name it, because they need to be able to get everywhere within the body in order to be a responder to an infection. So that's all for the lymphatic system. I will be back shortly to start on the immune system.